So if you walk up to like a random person on the street today, right, and you ask them what they actually know about the Trojan War, I guarantee you they are going to list 3, maybe 4 specific things.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very predictable list.
Right. First, they are going to mention the Trojan horse. You know, that giant wooden decoy filled with soldiers slipping through the gates of Troy.
Yep, the classic.
And second, they were going to talk about Achilles having a vulnerable heel. The famous Achilles heel that eventually gets him killed.
Right.
And third, they might bring up, you know, the golden apple, the beauty contest among the goddesses, the judgment of Paris. That supposedly started the whole geopolitical mess in the first place.
Which is a great story.
It is. And if they really know their mythology, they might even mention King Agamemnon sacrificing his own daughter just to get the wind to blow his fleet to the war.
Yeah, that is, it's basically the ultimate pop culture checklist for ancient Greece. Those are the big tentpole moments.
Right. But here is the mind-blowing reality that completely reframes how we have to look at this topic today. Not a single one of those things is actually in the Iliad.
It's wild to think about, yeah.
It's crazy. There is no wooden horse. There is no arrow to the heel. There's no divine beauty contest. And there is absolutely no sacrificed daughter.
None of it.
Almost everything our modern world thinks it knows about the Trojan War is practically nowhere to be found in the foundational text that supposedly tells its story. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are grabbing our hard hats, and we're taking you directly into, well, probably the most famous literary construction site in human history.
Which is such a vital way to look at it, I think, because we have this tendency to view ancient monumental works like the Iliad as if they are, you know, the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Yeah, like you stand back, you look at the smooth, imposing shape, and it just feels inevitable. It feels like it was always meant to be exactly that perfect, unyielding monolith.
Right, like it just dropped out of the sky.
Exactly. But when you walk up to the stone, you see the chisel marks, you see the scaffolding, you see the compromises made by the actual human beings who are sweating and struggling to build the thing.
And that is exactly our mission today. We are prying up the floorboards of this ancient epic. We are going to look past the surface level myth of the Trojan War to understand the actual psychological gears and the really brilliant, sometimes super manipulative narrative mechanics that make it work.
And we really have to get into the psychology. Yeah.
We do. We're going to explore why these characters make decisions that seem completely baffling to us today. How a master storyteller hijacked a centuries-old oral tradition to create a masterpiece, and why, like we just established, the most famous parts of the war were intentionally left on the cutting room floor.
So to do this properly, we are relying on some truly phenomenal sources today.
Yes, we are.
One is a really excellent deep dive into the ancient Greek cultural concept of Cleos, or glory. And that's drawn from Fiveable's historical study materials. It provides the psychological blueprint for basically every single warrior on that beach.
Right. It explains why they tick.
Exactly. And the other source is Richmond Lattimore's famous introduction to his translation of the Iliad. And Lattimore doesn't just read the poem. He acts like a structural engineer, reverse engineering a skyscraper. He looks at the literal line-by-line mechanics.
So let's start by setting the actual stage, because if the Iliad isn't the definitive, A to Z encyclopedia of a 10-year siege, what actually is it?
It is a laser-focused, intensely claustrophobic tragedy about one single emotion, anger.
Just anger.
Just anger. Specifically the anger of one man, Achilles. The poem doesn't start at the beginning of the war, and it definitely doesn't end with the fall of the city.
Right.
It drops us right into the middle of the 10th year of the conflict, and the entire narrative spans just a few weeks. The scope is incredibly tight. It is basically a character study wrapped in the guise of a war epic.
Which naturally raises a massive question for anyone listening. Imagine you are an ancient poet. You have this sprawling, cinematic world war at your disposal. You have magic, you have gods fighting, you have a literal decade of material.
It's an endless sandbox.
Right. So why would you purposefully narrow your camera lens down to just a few weeks and focus almost entirely on one guy throwing a catastrophic temper tantrum over a perceived slight?
Because to the ancient Greek audience, that temper tantrum wasn't just a mood swing. It was a matter of cosmic existential survival.
Wow. Okay, existential survival.
Yeah. To understand why this narrow focus works so brilliantly, we have to talk about the fundamental currency of the ancient Greek world. We have to understand the terrifying reality of what these people believe happened to them when they died.
And this brings us to a concept that completely shifted my perspective on these myths when I read the sources. Because when we think of the afterlife today, many modern cultures have a comforting vision, right?
Right, there's usually some sort of reward.
Yeah, there are pearly gates, there is karma, there is a heavenly reward for living a good life, or perhaps a place of punishment for living a bad one. It's a system based on morality and justice. But the ancient Greeks, they did not have that safety net.
No, they didn't. Their cosmology was profoundly bleak. When you died in the Homeric world, your spirit went to the underworld, to Hades.
Right.
But Hades was not hell, and it certainly wasn't heaven. It was essentially a dark, joyless cavern where the dead existed as shades.
Just shadows?
Exactly. They were shadows, squeaking, gibbering echoes of their former self. They had no vitality, no strength, no real purpose. In many cases, they didn't even retain their memories or their full consciousness unless they drank the blood of a sacrificed animal.
Which is just so incredibly grim. It's the ultimate terrifying equalizer. Because it didn't matter if you were the wealthiest, most powerful king of Mycenae who ruled over thousands of men, or if you were the lowest, most impoverished beggar sleeping in the dirt.
It doesn't matter at all.
Death came for both of you, stripped you of your identity, and dropped you into the exact same gray, whispering void. There was no VIP section in Hades.
Precisely. No VIP section. And this creates a profound psychological crisis for the living. Because if death is an absolute erasure, if the afterlife offers absolutely nothing to strive for, then how do you find meaning?
Right. Why do anything?
Exactly. How do you achieve any form of permanence? The answer the Greek culture developed was that immortality cannot be achieved after death. It must be secure during life, and it must be carried forward by the living after you are gone.
Which leads us directly to the core concept our sources highlight, which is Cleos.
Yes, Cleos. It's typically translated as glory, renown, or fame. But equating it to modern fame is a massive injustice to the concept, I think.
Yeah, because we think of fame as going viral, having millions of followers, or being recognized in a restaurant. It's fleeting.
Exactly. In the Homeric world, Cleos is literal existential survival. The word itself comes from the Greek verb kouein, which means to hear.
To hear.
Right. Cleos is quite literally that which is heard about you. You live on only through the stories and the songs that other people share about your deeds.
So it's not just a nice bonus for winning a battle. It is the absolute defining purpose of a heroic life.
It is the only goal.
If you perform magnificent, courageous deeds, your name is woven into poetry, and you achieve a form of immortality. You defeat the erasure of Hades. But if you don't step up, if you live a quiet, unremarkable life, you just fade into nothingness. To be forgotten was the true, final death.
And this relentless pursuit of Cleos is governed by a very rigid framework called the heroic code. You don't get Cleos just by surviving. You get it by displaying aromedy, which translates to excellence or extreme virtue in your specific role.
And for a warrior, what does aromedy look like?
Well, for a warrior, aromedy means showing unflinching courage in the face of lethal danger. It means engaging in hand-to-hand combat where the risk of death is highest. It also involves a strict code of honor regarding how you treat your peers, how you distribute the spoils of war, and how fiercely you protect your reputation.
And this sets up the foundational dilemma of the entire Iliad. It all centers on a terrifying choice presented to Achilles. Our sources detail how his mother, Thetis, who is a sea goddess, comes to him with a prophecy.
Yes, she lays out two mutually exclusive paths for his destiny.
Right.
It's the ultimate hypothetical scenario, but for him, it's real. Pac One Achilles can pack up his ships right now, leave the beaches of Troy, sail back home to his kingdom of Stygia, and live a long, peaceful, happy life.
Sounds pretty good to us.
Right. He will grow old, he will bounce his grandchildren on his knee, and he will die comfortably in his bed. But the catch is, his Cleos will die with him. He will be entirely forgotten by history.
And path 2.
Path 2. He stays at Troy, he fights, and he's guaranteed to die young. He will never see his home again. It is a literal death sentence. But if he chooses this violent early death, he will win Cleos Aphthton, which means imperishable, unfading glory. His name will be sung forever.
And of course, he chooses the glory. He actively, consciously signs his own death warrant because the alternative, being erased by time, becoming a nameless shade in the dark, is entirely unacceptable to his nature.
He trades his physical life for his historical permanence.
Right. And knowing that Achilles has made this ultimate sacrifice is so crucial because it explains his behavior when we get to the inciting incident of the epic.
It does, yeah. Because the pursuit of Cleos does not happen in a vacuum. It is deeply connected to another, more immediate concept that the sources focus heavily on, which is time.
Okay, yes. I found the distinction between these two terms incredibly helpful. If Cleos is the eternal overarching glory that lives on after you die, what exactly is Timon?
So, time is immediate, tangible honor and standing. It is how your peers treat you right now, in the present moment. Think of it as your social capital or your immediate status within the hierarchy of the army.
Okay.
And in the physical reality of the Greek camp at Troy, time isn't just an abstract feeling of respect. It is quantified by physical things. It is measured by the amount of war plunder you are awarded, the size and prime location of your tent, the quality of the armor you wear, and most importantly, the public deference and obedience you command from other men.
I love trying to find modern equivalents for this to make it click. So tell me if this analogy works. It's like time is your current bank account balance and your lofty job title at a corporation. You can point to it, people see it, and they treat you accordingly. But Cleos is your Wikipedia page. It's the permanent record of your legacy that will exist 100 years from now.
That is a phenomenal analogy. I love that. And here is the critical mechanical link between the two. You cannot secure the glorious permanent Wikipedia page if your current bank account is publicly emptied and your job title is stripped from you by a rival.
Wow.
Okay? Yeah, the eternal memory of Cleos is built directly out of the immediate materials of time. You can't be remembered as a legendary figure tomorrow if you allow yourself to be treated like a peasant today.
Which brings us to the explosion in Book 1. The Greeks have been camped on the beach at Troy for 9 brutal years. Suddenly, a plague starts ripping through their camp, killing men and animals.
Just a horrific situation.
Right. So they call in a prophet, and the prophet reveals that the god Apollo is shooting plague arrows at them because Agamemnon, who is the supreme commander of the Greek forces, has committed a massive offense. He took a captive woman named Croesus as a war prize, and her father happens to be a priest of Apollo. The priest offered a huge ransom, but Agamemnon insulted him and chased him away.
And so the only way to stop the plague is for Agamemnon to give the woman back. And under immense public pressure, led largely by Achilles, actually, Agamemnon is forced to relent. But Agamemnon is the high king. He's the CEO of this entire coalition.
Right. He's the boss.
Exactly. So being forced to publicly back down and return his prize is a massive blow to his time. He feels completely publicly diminished.
So to reassert his dominance, Agamemnon essentially says, fine, I'll give my prize back to save the army. But I am the boss, so I am going to take someone else's prize to compensate myself.
Yep.
And out of all the warriors he could have targeted, he sets his sights on Achilles. He demands Briseis, a captive woman who had been awarded to Achilles by the army as a physical representation of his martial excellence. Agamemnon sends his heralds to Achilles' tent, and they take her away.
And this is the moment the entire epic pivots on. This is the collision of two immovable objects. Agamemnon is using his political time, his status as the commander-in-chief, to violently crush Achilles' martial time, his status as the greatest individual fighter.
Now, I have to stop here and push back on behalf of a modern reader, because when you read this today, Achilles looks incredibly petty. He throws what can only be described as a catastrophic tantrum.
He really does.
He withdraws all of his men from the fighting. He sits by the ships weeping. He even prays to his divine mother to go to Zeus and ask the gods to actively help the Trojans slaughter his own Greek allies.
It's extreme.
It is. He is willing to watch his friends die in the mud over one captive woman. We know he's destined to die young for eternal glory, so why is he throwing the entire war effort away over a temporary loss of time? It feels like he's losing the forest for the trees.
It absolutely feels petty to a modern sensibility because we value the collective good over individual pride. Yeah. But in the psychological landscape of the ancient Greek hero, Achilles is reacting entirely logically to an existential threat.
An existential threat.
Yes. The woman, Briseis, is a human being, obviously. But in the brutal economy of the epic, she functions as a physical manifestation of Achilles' honor. When Agamemnon takes her, he isn't just taking a companion. He is publicly, in front of tens of thousands of armed men, stating that Achilles' contributions are worthless.
He's humiliating him.
Yes. And humiliation is fatal to Cleos. Think about the terrifying choice Achilles made. He traded a long life for the guarantee of being remembered as the absolute greatest, most fearsome, untouchable warrior who ever lived.
Right.
How can you possibly be remembered as an untouchable force of nature if the history books show that another man publicly bullied you, stole the symbol of your excellence, and treated you like a subordinate foot soldier without facing any consequences? If Achilles simply shrugs his shoulders and says, oh, well, it's for the good of the army, he completely invalidates the premise of his own glory.
Ah, okay. The data gets corrupted. If he accepts the disrespect in the present, his Wikipedia page won't say, Achilles, the unstoppable force of nature. It will say, Achilles, the really good fighter who let King Agamemnon walk all over him.
Exactly.
And for a man who is literally paying with his life for that Wikipedia page, that is an unacceptable breach of contract.
You nailed it. The heroic code demands that you protect your time with lethal force if necessary, because it is the very foundation of your Cleos. Agamemnon knows this too. He's intentionally trying to prove that the time derived from sheer political power and a massive army is inherently superior to the time derived from individual skill, no matter how great that skill is. It is a profound clash of worldviews.
So Achilles makes his move. He essentially takes his maul and goes home. He retreats to his tent, pulls his elite Myrmidon warriors off the front line, and basically says, you don't respect my time. You think you can win without me. Let's see how much honor you have left when Hector and the Trojans are burning your ships down.
It's a bold strategy.
Very bold. He needs the Greek army to suffer so catastrophically that they are forced to crawl back to him, beg for his help, and publicly admit that his value is supreme. He is holding the entire war hostage to repair his honor.
And this massive withdrawal creates a fascinating mechanical problem for the storyteller.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the next crucial layer of the Iliad's construction.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, earning Cleos requires an audience.
Right.
You cannot be great in secret. You need witnesses to your excellence.
Mm-hmm.
With Achilles, the massive sun at the center of the solar system, suddenly removed from the sky, it leaves a massive vacuum on the battlefield.
It's an open stage, and this completely changes the dynamics of the war. With Achilles out, the fighting doesn't stop, it actually escalates. And this brings us to the specific, highly structured mechanics of how combat is portrayed in the poem, centering on a concept called an aristeia.
Yes. An aristeia is one of the most thrilling narrative devices in ancient literature. It is essentially a hero's moment of absolute peak battlefield performance. It is an extended sequence where the narrative spotlight focuses entirely on one warrior as they go on an unstoppable rampage. They become an elemental force of destruction.
It really is like watching an action movie where the main character enters a hallway and just takes out 20 guys in one unbroken tracking shot. Or like in video game terms, it's when you get the invincibility star in Super Mario.
With the Mario star, yes.
You start glowing, the music speeds up, and you just sprint through the level, obliterating everything you touch.
That's a very accurate comparison for the energy of it. But an aristeia in Homer isn't just chaotic violence. It follows a very specific, recognizable choreography.
Like a formula.
Yeah, exactly. It usually begins with a detailed scene of the hero donning their armor piece by piece, building the anticipation. Then, they charge into the thickest part of the battle. They engage formidable enemy champions in single combat and slaughter them. They perform feats of strength that border on the superhuman.
Wow.
Often, to raise the stakes, the hero might receive a minor wound, but they shrug it off, driven by an almost divine frenzy. By the end of it, this single man has completely shifted the momentum of two clashing armies.
And the prime example of this, as our sources point out, happens right after Achilles leaves. In books 5 and 6, we get the aristeia of Diomedes, and it is unbelievable. Diomedes goes on such a violent, terrifying tear through the Trojan ranks that he actually breaks the boundary between mortals and immortals.
It was one of the craziest parts of the book.
He ends up fighting gods. He stabs Aphrodite, the goddess of love, right through the wrist, and later he drives a spear into the gut of Ares, the god of war himself. A mortal man making the god of war scream in pain and flee the battlefield.
It is a stunning display of power. But this incredible sequence highlights a massive structural dilemma that Richmond Lattimore explores deeply in his analysis. He calls it Homer's dilemma. Let's break down the logic of the plot. Theoretically, the Iliad could be a very clean, simple, 3-act short story.
Right. Act 1, Agamemnon insults Achilles. Achilles quits. Act 2, without Achilles, the Greeks immediately get crushed by the Trojans, and Achilles' best friend, Patroclus, is killed trying to save them. Act 3, Achilles goes berserk with grief, returns to the battle, slaughters the Trojans, kills their champion Hector, and reclaims his honor. The end. It makes perfect logical sense.
It does. But the Iliad is not a short story. It is a massive, sprawling epic of nearly 16,000 lines, divided into 24 books. Homer has to stretch this core narrative out over a huge canvas, and in doing so, he has to balance two completely contradictory narrative goals simultaneously.
Okay, let's look at goal number 1. Goal number 1 is driven by the plot itself. Homer absolutely must prove that Achilles was right to withdraw. He has to prove that the Greeks cannot possibly win without him. Therefore, the narrative demands that the Greek army must lose. They must be battered, demoralized, and driven all the way back to their ships, facing total annihilation.
But then you have goal number 2, which is entirely driven by the audience listening to the poem.
Oh, right, the actual people in the room.
Exactly. Homer's performing this epic for audiences of Greek aristocrats who claim direct bloodline descent from the heroes in the story. They trace their ancestry back to Diomedes, to Odysseus, to Agamemnon, to great Ajax. Homer absolutely cannot stand in front of these powerful men and sing a song about how their great-great-grandfathers were weak, incompetent cowards who got immediately steamrolled the second Achilles walked away.
Yeah, that's a fast way for a bard to get thrown out of the banquet hall.
Very fast. He has to preserve the Cleos of the entire Greek ensemble cast while mathematically ensuring that they lose the battle. So how do you have an army of invincible superheroes lose a war without making them look bad?
It's a brilliant puzzle. How does he actually solve it?
Lattimore points out that Homer solves it through a narrative cycle he calls the achilles situation. The battle begins, and despite missing their greatest fighter, the Greeks actually start winning. Homer gives the spotlight to the ancestors of his audience. We get the Aristeia of Diomedes, we get Agamemnon tearing through the front lines, we get Odysseus and Ajax holding their ground like titans.
So they get their moment in the sun.
Yes. They look incredible. They push the Trojans back. The audience gets to cheer for their legendary forefathers. Homer validates their greatness.
So he lets the supporting cast have their spectacular solo fight scenes. They prove they belong in the elite tier. But wait, if they are winning, how does Homer advance the plot? He still needs them to lose so Achilles can return. He has to get these superheroes off the stage.
And that is where Homer's narrative engineering gets really, really clever. He has to sideline these great heroes, but he cannot allow them to be defeated in fair hand-to-hand combat against a Trojan warrior. If Diomedes loses a straight-up sword fight, his Cleos is damaged, the audience is insulted. So Homer uses cheap shots.
Archery.
Precisely, archery. In the rigid hierarchy of the heroic code, using a bow and arrow is viewed with a certain amount of disdain. It is seen as less honorable because you are striking from a safe distance. You aren't looking your enemy in the eye. You aren't risking your own life in the brutal crush of close-quarters spear fighting is the ancient equivalent of a sniper rifle.
It's asymmetrical warfare. And the primary culprit for this is Paris. Paris is the Trojan prince who kidnapped Helen. He is constantly portrayed as more of a lover than a fighter. He prefers hanging out in his bedroom to getting muddy on the battlefield, but he is a skilled archer. And Homer uses him as the great equalizer.
It is.
Paris shoots Diomedes in the foot, pinning him to the ground. He shoots the great Greek healer Machaon. Odysseus gets surrounded and stabbed by a guy he immediately turns around and kills, but the wound is deep enough to force him out. Even Agamemnon gets a spear through his arm and has to retreat in his chariot.
One by one, the great Greek champions are systematically cleared off the board. But note the methodology. They are never truly beaten in a duel. They never surrender. They don't run away in fear. They are forced to retreat due to secondary, almost accidental wounds inflicted from a distance or from behind.
That's so smart.
It is. Homer masterfully preserves their dignity while mathematically forcing the Greek army into a desperate retreat.
It's incredible. He is managing the public relations for an entire mythological army. So let's flip the perspective then. If the Greek heroes are this overwhelmingly powerful and they are only losing due to attrition, archery, and bad luck, what does this mean for the final boss of the Trojans? To capitalize on this retreat and push the Greeks all the way back to their ships, Hector, the supreme commander of Troy, must be an absolute monster. He must be the ancient Terminator.
Well, this is one of the most fascinating revelations in Lattimore's textual analysis. He exposes what we can call the brilliant illusion of Hector. If you just listen to the rhetoric in the poem, what the characters say about Hector, and how the narrator introduces him, he sounds terrifying.
The hype is real.
Well, the hype is massive. Achilles uses Hector's name as a bogeyman to scare Agamemnon. The Greek heroes openly admit they are afraid to face him. Homer compares Hector's charge to a destructive wildfire, to a boulder tearing down a mountain, to the god of war himself. The buildup suggests Hector is a Goliath, a giant towering over lesser men.
But Lattimore says, hold on, ignore the hype. Look at the play-by-play text. Look at what Hector actually does. And when you do that, the reality doesn't quite match the terrifying reputation.
Not at all. When you strip away the poetic similes and look at his actual combat record, Hector's performance is surprisingly flawed and deeply human.
Really?
Yes. He frequently makes grand, boastful speeches to his troops, promising total victory, but then fails to deliver. When the fighting gets incredibly thick and desperate, there are moments where he hangs back in the ranks. More tellingly, when a top-tier Greek hero actually stands up and forces Hector into single combat, Hector rarely wins outright.
Oh, okay.
When he fights great Ajax, Ajax clearly overpowers him, eventually smashing him to the ground with a massive rock. Diomedes forces him to give ground. And most famously, when he finally faces Achilles, Hector's nerve completely breaks. He turns and runs away in sheer panic, running 3 full laps around the massive walls of Troy until the goddess Athena tricks him into stopping and facing his death.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm getting this. The great champion of Troy, the terror of the Greeks, the man whose name is practically synonymous with noble defense, is actually kind of outmatched. Is he a fraud?
It is deeply unfair to call him a fraud.
Yeah.
He is incredibly brave. He bears the unbearable weight of his entire city's survival on his shoulders, and he is a lethal fighter. But structurally, he is deliberately diminished by the author. Think back to Homer's dilemma.
Okay, the balancing act.
Right. Homer has a structural need to make Hector the instrument of the Greek defeat. Hector must push them to the ships. But simultaneously, Homer refuses to let Hector actually outclass the Greek VIPs in fair hand-to-hand combat, because that would ruin their Cleos.
So he uses incredible narrative sleight of hand. He talks Hector up, but nerfs him in the actual gameplay.
Exactly. And the most glaring, undeniable example of this sleight of hand is the climax of the Trojan counterattack, the death of Patroclus. This is supposed to be Hector's defining triumph. Patroclus is Achilles' most beloved companion. Killing him is the act that seals Hector's own doom by forcing Achilles back into the war. You would expect this to be the most epic, earth-shattering duel in the entire poem.
But it's not an epic duel at all, is it?
Far from it. When Patroclus enters the battle wearing Achilles' armor, he goes on an absolute tear. He is slaughtering Trojans and driving them back to the city walls. Hector cannot stop him. So Homer introduces divine intervention to tip the scales.
Oh, here come the gods.
Yep, the god Apollo wraps himself in a thick mist, sneaks up behind Patroclus and strikes him on the back. The blow is so powerful it knocks Patroclus' helmet off, shatters his massive spear, drops his shield, and completely stuns him. Patroclus is standing there, dazed, blind, and totally disarmed.
The god literally turns off his controller.
Yes. But Hector still doesn't strike. While Patroclus is standing there stunned, a minor, unheralded Trojan warrior named Euphorbos sneaks up and drives a spear right into Patroclus' back.
You're kidding?
Nope. And he doesn't even finish the job. Euphorbos stabs him and immediately runs away in fear. Only then, after Patroclus has been disarmed and stunned by a god and bleeding heavily from a spear wound in his back, does Hector finally run up and deliver the fatal blow to a man who is already dying. And the crowning irony is that Hector then stands over the body and boasts to the dying Patroclus as if he just won a fair, glorious duel.
It is the ultimate kill steal. That is almost comically unsportsmanlike. But when you understand the mechanics we just talked about, it makes total sense why Homer wrote it that way.
It does.
Because if Hector beats Patroclus fairly, it implies Hector might actually be a better warrior than Patroclus. And since Patroclus is wearing Achilles' armor and serving as his direct proxy, Hector beating him fairly damages the aura of Achilles. Furthermore, if Hector really is an unstoppable giant who can beat anyone fairly, it makes Diomedes and Ajax look bad for not being able to stop him earlier.
You see all the threads pulling together now.
Yeah. By having a god and a random guy in the background do 90% of the work, Homer protects the Cleos of the Greeks, preserves the invincibility of Achilles, and still gives Hector the kill he needs to advance the plot. It is a masterful, delicate balancing act of mythological reputation management.
It truly is. Homer is not just mindlessly reciting a chronicle of who stabbed whom. He is sculpting a highly specific, emotionally complex drama, making incredibly strict choices about who looks good, who gets hurt, and how the narrative engine moves forward. And realizing that he is making these deliberate editorial choices brings us to perhaps the most shocking aspect of his process, what he aggressively decided not to include in this sculpture.
So let's transition into this idea of the missing pieces, the basic story versus what Homer actually wrote. Because as we touched on at the very beginning, the Trojan War wasn't just a bedtime story for the ancient Greeks. They understood it as actual, literal history.
Yes, it was set in a distant, heroic past to pre-Dorian era, where the men fighting were called Achaeans, Argives, or Danans, not Greeks. They believed these ancestors were larger, stronger, and closer to the gods. But they believed the war fundamentally happened. And because of this, the oral tradition provided Homer with a massive pre-existing basic story that everyone in his audience already knew by heart.
It's like doing a movie about World War II. You can focus on a specific squad of soldiers, but the audience already knows who Hitler is, they know D-Day happens, and they know how the war ends. You can't change the fixed points of history.
Exactly. Homer inherited an architecture of lore. He couldn't suddenly decide that Troy wins the war and survives. He couldn't let Achilles live and go home to be a farmer. The overarching boundaries of the legend were set in stone.
Yet, despite having this massive, rich tapestry of mythology at his fingertips, the Iliad completely ignores huge, famous swathes of it. I really want to linger on this list from Lattimore's source because it is so striking when you fully absorb it.
It really puts it in perspective.
Right, let's look at the judgment of Paris. This is the inciting incident of the entire war. 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, arguing over a golden apple marked for the fairest. Paris, the Trojan prince, acts as the judge. He chooses Aphrodite because she bribes him with the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. He goes to Sparta, takes Helen, and starts a world war. In the Iliad, this massive dramatic origin story is barely alluded to. There is one incredibly cryptic single-sentence mention in the very last book about Paris insulting goddesses in his courtyard, and that's it. Swept entirely under the rug.
Or look at the sacrifice of Iphigenia. The entire Greek armada is gathered to sail to Troy, but the winds won't blow. The prophet tells Agamemnon he must sacrifice his own virgin daughter to appease the goddess Artemis. It is a massive, traumatic, defining event that completely shapes Agamemnon's dark psychology. The Iliad does not mention it once.
And the climax of the war. The Trojan horse. The brilliant, desperate trick devised by Odysseus that finally breaks the 10-year siege. A giant wooden horse filled with elite killers. It is the most famous military deception in history. Never mentioned in the Iliad. You only hear about it later in the Odyssey.
Yep.
And lastly, Achilles' invulnerable heel. The idea that his mother dipped him in the magic river Styx when he was a baby, making his skin impenetrable everywhere except the heel she held him by. Our sources explicitly confirm this is a much later invention. Homer's Achilles is completely 100% mortal. He does not have magic skin. He bleeds. He has to wear armor just like everyone else.
When you look at that list together, you realize how radical and confident Homer's editorial vision was. He had access to all of this rich, crowd-pleasing, dramatic material, a beauty contest to the gods, the sacrifice of an innocent princess, a giant wooden horse. Any conventional storyteller would cram every single one of those elements in to make the ultimate blockbuster epic.
Imagine.
But Homer looks at that massive pile of lore and says, no, that is marginal material.
Marginal? How on earth can the Trojan horse be considered marginal to the story of the Trojan War?
Because, as we established earlier, the Iliad is not the story of the Trojan War. It is the story of the anger of Achilles. That is its singular, unyielding focus. If an event, a myth, or a character does not directly serve the tragic arc of Achilles' anger, his withdrawal, his grief over Patroclus, and his devastating, dehumanizing revenge against Hector, Homer ruthlessly cuts it out.
He just trims the fat.
Exactly. He assumes his sophisticated audience already knows the background, so he refuses to waste time on exposition. He actively strips away the fairy tale elements, the magic apples, the invulnerability spells, and forces the audience to focus entirely on the brutal, psychological reality of human choices, human pride, and human mortality.
So picture everything you've ever seen in a movie about Troy. Now take a red pen and cross out almost all of it. That is the Iliad. And this editorial ruthlessness creates a fascinating cultural reaction. Because Homer left so much amazing lore on the cutting room floor, it created a massive, ravenous demand for more content from the audience.
It left a void that had to be filled.
It is so analogous to modern fandoms. It's like Homer made this incredible, prestige, highly focused indie film. It wins all the awards. It's recognized as a masterpiece, but it leaves the hardcore lore nerds incredibly frustrated.
They want more.
Right. They are saying, wait, what happened before? How did the city actually fall? What happened to Achilles' armor? They can't handle the ambiguity or the abrupt ending, so later writers step in to create the massive, formulaic, cinematic universe, the prequels, the sequels, the spin-offs, just to tie up every single plot hole and show all the cool stuff Homer skipped.
That is exactly what happened. The Lattimore source details this phenomenon beautifully. In the centuries following Homer, there emerged a series of poems known collectively as the epic cycle. These were composed by other poets, specifically to fill in the blank spaces around the Iliad and the Odyssey.
What were these poems actually doing?
They were essentially painting by numbers. You had the Cypria, a massive poem that covered everything from the judgment of Paris, the gathering of the ships, the first 9 years of the war, leading right up to the exact moment the Iliad begins. Then you had the Aethiopis, which picked up the exact second the Iliad ended, detailing the arrival of the Amazons to help Troy, and the eventual death of Achilles himself. You had the Little Iliad and the Sacavillion, which covered the building of the wooden horse and the horrific, violent fall of the city.
They are literally just building walls around Homer's house.
Yes. And Lattimore points out how distinctly businesslike and systematic these cycle poems were compared to the Iliad. They weren't profound psychological tragedies, they were chronicles. They were designed specifically to complete the timeline from A to Z. And the existence of the epic cycle proves something vital.
What's that?
Well, if Homer had come after them, there would be these weird, jagged gaps in the cycle where the Iliad fits. But because the cycle poems meticulously framed themselves around the Iliad, starting exactly where it starts and stopping exactly where it ends, it proves that Homer's poem was already this immovable, authoritative monument in the center of their culture. The later poets were actively writing around him. They were inventing patches for perceived plot holes. The invulnerable heel, for example, is a later patch to explain how a mediocre archer like Paris could possibly kill the great Achilles when even the mighty Hector couldn't.
So Homer is the sun, and the epic cycle is just a system of planets orbiting his gravity. But this brings up a massive question. If Homer was working from this vast oral tradition and he's just aggressively selecting bits and pieces to fit his narrative, how do we know he didn't just invent his main characters?
That's a common question, yeah.
Like, how do we know he didn't just invent Hector or Patroclus out of thin air to serve his specific indie film plot about Achilles' anger? Maybe they weren't in the original lore at all.
We can answer that by looking very closely at the text itself, specifically how the narrator introduces people. If a modern author invents a brand new major character, they have an obligation to introduce them to the reader. They have to provide backstory, explain who they are, describe them, and establish why they matter.
Of course.
But Homer doesn't do that. When he mentions Helen's scandalous flight from Sparta, he mentions it casually, in passing, as a reference. He knows the audience already knows exactly what she did. When Hector is first mentioned in Book 1, he isn't given a grand introduction. His name is just used by Achilles as a threat against Agamemnon.
And what about Patroclus, the catalyst for the entire climax?
When Patroclus first appears, Homer simply refers to him by his father's name. He calls him Menoetes.
He literally just says, oh, and Menoetes' kid was there too. No fanfare whatsoever.
Right. You absolutely do not introduce a completely new, pivotal character who will drive the emotional climax of the poem in such an offhand way. Homer introduces them casually because he knew the audience already knew exactly who Patroclus and Hector were. The tradition, the characters, the basic story, it all existed long before he came along. Homer's genius was not in inventing the mythology from scratch. His absolute genius lay in how he curated it, how he arranged the pre-existing pieces, and how he elevated the material from a simple chronicle of violent events into a profoundly structured human tragedy.
He didn't invent the lore, he just wrote the definitive, untouchable story within the lore. But this leads us to what is perhaps the most mind-bending logistical question of all. We spent all this time talking about Homer writing and editing and curating, but we are talking about a world where writing, as a common tool for composition, didn't really exist.
No, it didn't.
How did Homer and the generations of poets who came before him actually compose, memorize, and perform these massive 16,000-line epics? They couldn't just open a laptop, type out a draft, copy and paste a stanza, and save it to a hard drive. They had to use a completely different kind of technology. They used an incredible piece of ancient biological software.
Which brings us full circle to our very first point today. Let's look again at the Greek word Cleos, glory. We said it comes from the verb kluin, meaning to hear. Glory only exists if there is someone physically present to hear it. Therefore, the bards, the poets, the rhapsodes who stood by a fire or in a crowded banquet hall and recited the Iliad from memory, they were not just entertainers, they were the actual physical engines of Cleos.
So the performance of the poem is the creation of the glory. Every single time a bard took a breath and recited the Iliad, they were actively resurrecting Achilles. They were fulfilling the terrifying promise that Thetis made to her son. The poem isn't a record of the transaction, it is the currency itself.
Exactly. But doing this aloud, reciting thousands of lines purely from memory, and sometimes improvising or expanding on scenes based on the audience's reaction, requires an incredibly robust cognitive system. You can't just memorize it like a script. You need a framework. And the forces go deep into the highly specific style Homer relied on, which is governed entirely by the meter, specifically the dactylic hexameter.
Okay, this is a technical term, but it is the absolute beating heart of the poem.
Right.
We need to explain exactly how this works. What does dactylic hexameter actually mean physically when spoken out loud?
Let's break it down. A dactyl comes from the Greek word for finger. If you look at your finger, it has one long joint followed by two shorter joints. In poetry, a dactyl is one long, heavy syllable, followed by two short, light syllables. It sounds like a galloping horse. Doom-da-da.
Okay.
Hexameter means there are 6 of these rhythmic units, or feet, in every single line of the poem.
So the rhythm of the entire epic, line after line after line, goes dum-da-da, 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 dum-dum-dum. It is a relentless, driving beat.
It is hypnotic, and the poet must adhere to this rhythm flawlessly. To satisfy the strict demands of this meter while composing or reciting at speed, the poet couldn't simply pause, scratch his chin, and try to think of the perfect, unique adjective for every situation. If you pause, the rhythm dies, the spell is broken, and the Cleos stops. So they utilized an incredibly sophisticated system of formulae.
These are the famous Homeric epithets, noun adjective combinations that are permanently welded together. We hear them all the time. Swift-footed Achilles, wily Odysseus, Hector, breaker of horses, rosy-fingered Dawn, gray-eyed Athena. Our sources note that on a cultural level, these epithets act as Cleos in miniature. They are a compressed, recurring reminder of the hero's core reputation.
That is the cultural function for sure, but the mechanical function is where it gets truly astonishing. This brings us to a revolutionary discovery made by an American scholar named Milman Parry in the 1920s. Parry traveled to Yugoslavia to study modern, illiterate bards who could recite massive oral epics, trying to understand how Homer did it.
And what did he find?
What Parry realized, and what Lattimore discusses in detail in his intro, is that these epithets aren't always chosen because they fit the emotional context of the specific scene. They are chosen almost entirely based on how many syllables the poet needs to finish the rhythmic line.
This is the part that feels like looking at the green cascading code of the Matrix. Give us the example using Zeus from the source, because it perfectly illustrates the mechanics of this software.
Imagine the poet is mid-recitation.
Yeah.
He is composing a line aloud, he's galloping along the rhythm, and he gets near the end of the line. The narrative requires him to say that Zeus did something. Now, depending on what words he used in the first half of the line, he will have a specific metrical gap left to fill. If he has a certain arrangement of long and short syllables left over, he will reach into his mental toolbox and use the phrase Metita Zeus, which means Zeus of the councils.
It fits perfectly into the slot.
Right. But if the metrical gap he needs to fill is a different size, perhaps slightly longer, or requiring a different combination of beats, he will automatically use Nepheliterata Zeus, which means Zeus the cloud gatherer. He does not choose cloud gatherer because Zeus is actually making it rain or summoning a storm in that specific scene. It might be a perfectly sunny day in the narrative. He chooses it simply because the physical shape of the phrase perfectly fills the hole in the rhythmic line.
It is exactly like predictive text or autofill on a smartphone keyboard. The poet knows he has exactly 3.5 feet of meter left to fill, so he mentally hits the macro button for long-suffering, brilliant Odysseus, because it snaps perfectly into place like a Lego brick, allowing him to keep the rhythm going without stumbling.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it, honestly. It is a massive oral database of prefabricated phrases, strictly categorized by their metrical length. And because the poet is bound by the rhythm above all else, this system occasionally produces incredibly funny, glaring contradictions in the text.
The glitches in the Matrix.
Exactly. For instance, there is a famous moment where Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is wounded in battle by Diomedes. She is bleeding immortal blood and crying in absolute agony. But because of the metrical space required at the end of the line, the poet uses her standard preset formula. So the text literally reads that laughing Aphrodite is crying in pain.
That is amazing.
Or take Aegisthus. In the lore, Aegisthus is a notoriously treacherous, cowardly murderer who seduces Agamemnon's wife and stabs him to death at a dinner table. But in one line, he is referred to as blameless Aegisthus, simply because the adjective blameless has the exact metrical footprint needed to sit next to his name. Or Helen, after running away from her husband Menelaos and causing a 10-year war, casually refers to him as her beloved wife's husband because it fits the meter.
Blameless murderer Aegistos. It's so jarring when you notice it, but wait, I have to push back heavily on this idea. Because if the entire poem is really just a bunch of padded, recycled Lego bricks being blindly snapped together by an autofill algorithm to fit a drumbeat, doesn't that fundamentally destroy the idea of Homer's genius?
It's a fair point.
Like, if he's just hitting a macro button and plugging in preset formulas, is it just a human algorithm? Have we been overhyping him for 3,000 years?
It is a deeply fair question, and it is one that deeply troubled literary scholars when Milman Parry first presented his theory. It felt like he had completely demystified the magic, reducing poetry to math. But this raises a profound question about art itself. Does working within a strict, unyielding set of rules diminish the art, or does it elevate it?
Well, a sonnet has very strict rules, and Shakespeare still made them brilliant.
Exactly. The formulas are traditional. The Lego bricks were inherited from generations of nameless bards who came before him. Homer did not invent swift-footed Achilles. But his genius lies in the architecture he builds with those inherited bricks. He manipulates these standard counters to create a pacing, a shifting tone, and a devastating tragic structure that is entirely his own. But even more importantly, Lattimore points out that Homer does not only use the formula, he frequently breaks out of the matrix. And the place where he exercises his most original, vivid, and unique voice is in his similes.
Ah, the similes. These are the moments where he pauses the narrative of the battle to compare the action to something else entirely. And they are wild.
Yes. If you read later writers, like the Greek tragic playwrights or lyrical poets, they tend to use very tight, austere metaphors. A equals B. But Homeric similes are expansive, developing ecosystems. They start with a simple comparison and then take on a sprawling life of their own. And unlike the narratives of the war, which is constrained by strict tradition, ancient lore, and metrical formulae, the similes are where Homer's direct observation of the real world shines through. He takes this brutal, distant, aristocratic Bronze Age war, and he compares it to the most mundane, everyday, recognizable things.
Break down the example from the source about the wounded soldier, because the contrast is really breathtaking.
Right, so during the fighting, Menelaus, the king of Sparta, is struck by an arrow. The text describes the blood running down his thighs and his shins. A lesser poet would just say the blood was red or that it flowed like a river. Homer pauses the war, and he compares the sight of the blood to a Maeonian or Carian woman far away in a peaceful room, carefully staining a piece of precious white ivory with purple dye to make a decorative cheek piece for a horse.
Wow.
The simile expands over several lines. Homer describes the craftsmanship of the woman, how the treasure is laid up in an inner room, how it is destined to be a king's prize, and how horsemen pray to have it.
He takes a moment of visceral horror and turns it into a meditation on a peaceful artisan crafting jewelry. Or take the simile about the woodcutter. The armies are clashing, it is peak violence, the air is thick with spears, men are screaming and dying in the dust. And Homer says, "It was the time of day when a woodcutter in the mountain glens makes his supper." Why? Because his arms are tired from chopping tall trees, his heart has had enough of the labor, and he just wants some sweet wine and food. It has absolutely nothing to do with the war.
Nothing at all. It has nothing to do with the heroic code, nothing to do with Arzate, nothing to do with Cleos. It is a moment of profound, exhausted humanity. And he does this constantly. He compares the terrifying roar of two armies colliding to winter rivers flooding together in a deep valley, while a solitary shepherd stands on a hill listening to the thunder from afar. He compares a deadly volley of arrows from men defending a wall to a silent, incessant snowstorm blanketing the mountain peaks, the lotus pastures, and the seashores on a cold winter day.
What is the psychological function of doing this? Why pull the camera so far back?
They serve as an essential psychological escape hatch. The Iliad is incredibly dense, claustrophobic, and blood-soaked. If you stay on that battlefield for 16,000 lines, the audience becomes numb. The similes pull the poet and the listeners out of the suffocating plains of legendary Troy and drop them momentarily into the real, recognizable, breathing world they actually live in.
It's a palate cleanser.
Exactly. The world of shepherds and woodcutters and craftsmen and weather. It provides a breathtaking contrast that makes the tragedy of the war feel even more profound. He uses the ordinary, peaceful moments of life to ground the epic destruction of death. It reminds the audience of exactly what these young men are dying for and what they will never see again.
That is beautiful. It is the ultimate testament to his skill. So let's pull all of this together. We started this deep dive looking at a monument from a distance, and we have spent the last hour crawling all over the scaffolding, looking at the mortar and the chisel marks.
We really have.
We have journeyed from the existential, terrifying dread of the Greek underworld, where the only escape from fading into a nameless shade is the relentless, violent pursuit of Cleos on the battlefield. We've seen how that desperate, absolute need for immediate time-measured and physical prizes and public respect caused Achilles to tear his own army apart over a captive woman.
And we've watched Homer pull off incredible narrative sleight of hand. He mathematically balanced the glory of his Greek VIPs against the tragic necessity of their defeat by using cheap shots and turning Hector into a terrifying illusion of a Goliath.
We explored how he ruthlessly, aggressively cut away the fairy tale elements, ignoring the Trojan horse, discarding the magic heel, skipping the golden apple, to focus entirely on the devastating human tragedy of Achilles' anger. And finally, we saw the underlying code of the matrix itself, the rhythmic, dactylic formulae that allowed illiterate bards to build the poem on the fly, and the beautiful grounding similes that provided a window out of the mythological past and into the everyday world.
It truly proves that the Iliad isn't just a story that happened to survive by historical accident. It survived because it is a spectacularly engineered piece of emotional and cultural machinery. It was built to last, block by block, syllable by syllable.
It was built to generate eternal Cleos. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the construction site of the Iliad. We promise more fascinating explorations into the mechanics of history and literature next time. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on the core concept we've explored today. For the ancient Greeks, Cleos, this ultimate, desperate immortality, depended entirely on the fragile biological chain of human memory. It depended on someone literally breathing your story into the air by a fire, and someone else caring enough to listen, remember it, and pass it down. Today, we have the exact opposite problem. Every digital action we take, every text message, every photo, every video we upload is recorded permanently in a server farm somewhere in the desert. We have achieved absolute permanence. But our collective human attention span is shorter than it has ever been in history. In a modern world where absolutely everything is saved, but nothing is truly deeply remembered, is Cleos even possible anymore? Are we building monuments that will last 3,000 years, or are we just generating a mountain of invisible, forgotten data? Something to think about. Until next time.